Hey guys, my name's Jack and I'm the Avid Assistant. So in this video I wanted to talk about something that gets asked about a lot, and it's something that Avid Media Composer does quite differently to some other NLEs. In fact, it gives assistants a lot of work to do, and that is the proxy workflow. Now, quick rundown if you're not familiar. Proxy workflow, otherwise known as an offline workflow, is converting your source camera media to a smaller resolution, lower res files that are in a codec that's more friendly to your editing system, or NLE. So for Avid, that might be something like, DNX, Avid's codec, or ProRes, if you're in Premiere or Final Cut, or whatever else. ProRes and DNX are kind of the two most edit-friendly codecs, and this will allow you, much better performance and playback because you're not taxing the system so much, having to read very, very large 4 or 4K or higher res files with extremely large data rates, stacked on top of effects and various other things or whatever else is on your timeline. If you're using, 1080p proxies at ProRes Proxy or DNxLB or something, your computer's going to have a much better time, decoding that, and, you'll have much smoother playback, and probably a better time editing as well. Now there's the theory, but how exactly does this work? Let me tell you. So we bring our source camera files into our NLE, or editing platform, and we will compress them down to make our proxies. So we've got our source camera res, and then we have our proxy clips. And our proxy clips we'll do all our cutting with, and then towards the end, when we have our edit locked and we're ready to start making masters and grades and things like that of our project, we'll link back to the source camera files, or otherwise known as linking back to online. Online, your source media, and offline, your proxies. Now, getting back to Avid Media Composer and what I'm here to talk about. So other NLEs like Adobe Premiere, Final Cut 10 from Apple, Blackmagic's DaVinci Resolve, and others have a much simpler way of dealing with this. And this all starts from the very beginning, from when you import media. Let me demonstrate. Right, so this is Final Cut Pro, Final Cut 10 from Apple, and I'll use them as our first demonstration of how we'd import media. So if I bring up the import window, I can browse and I can see media. I'll jump to something from the assisting course, right? So here's with some of the source files when I was doing the records for the A100 series. So when I import these files, I got a whole bunch of options here on the right. So first off, I can copy them into my library, so I have Final Cut manage the files and where they are, or leave them where they are, where I've stored them in the Finder. So I would normally do that and import these, and just bring them in straight like that, and that would be me good. But we also have an option down here called transcode, and Final Cut actually gives us two options here. We can create proxy media and we can create optimized media. And so what these two options are is you can create proxy media, and it will create like ProRes proxies by default. That would be the one I would use. So it'll be smaller res, smaller in resolution, depending on what your source is, smaller in bitrate, just easier to deal with. And you can also at the same time create optimized media. And so then whenever you have to do an export or something like that, or if you want to view it in a higher quality, it will use that for the playback and for the export. Now, you can do these later. You could just import it as it is, so it's not going to do any transcoding or any converting whatsoever. So for example, got some media here, and then I could just right click on any media I've brought in and go transcode media, and then create it there. And what this is going to do is it's going to create these other media, but it's going to still just have it attached to the same clip. So I don't have to track any other clips inside the editor. So my proxy media, my optimized media, my source, it'll all just read as one clip, and Final Cut will dynamically switch between them depending on the use of what I'm trying to do. So for exports, it can use the source to get the best quality. Playback, it can use the proxies. You'll get the best of both worlds, and Final Cut can manage all the tracking and relinking for you. Now the differences in Avid Media Composer in terms of proxy workflows and stuff like that actually begins right at the import stage. So let's start there. So this window here is the source browser. This is Avid's window for importing and bringing in media. You can find it under the File menu, Input, Source Browser. Now, there is still an option there, Import Media, but this is a legacy option that isn't really supported or intended for use anymore. So I'm not going to talk about it at this stage. Plus, in terms of proxy workflow, it's pretty much useless. It doesn't really come into it. It's going to transcode as you bring it in. So, Source Browser. You'll see down here at the bottom left hand of the source browser here, we have two options. We have link and import. Now, this is the main difference that confuses a lot of people, particularly if they're coming from another NLE over to Avid and they haven't really used Avid much before, is what the difference between these two is. You see, Avid's term import refers to bringing in media and re-encoding it into the Avid Media Files folder, which is where Avid always wants to store its media. See, just like how Final Cut has its event libraries, and ideally it wants you to copy the media there, even if you're not transcoding, Avid wants you to have all your media inside the Avid Media Files folder, which should be at the root level of whatever drive you're working on. So here's my RAID here, and there's my Avid Media Files folder. Now, if I hit import and there's a supported bit of media that I can import, it's going to transcode it to whatever codecs been preset in the settings and place it in there automatically. So unlike every other NLE, it won't just import it as in just look at the source media. That is what Avid refers to as linking. Look, just call it importing like all the rest of us. Linking. Come on, Avid, like all of us call it importing. Come on, just work with us here. Linking. But it is importing. Linking. Importing. Linking. Avid, buddy, come on. Join the club. Call it importing. Linking. It's importing. Linking! So I guess what I'm saying is that unlike other NLEs that have been used to cut everything from films to YouTube videos, Avid has primarily always been about long-form proxy workflow standardized way of working. So what is the approved Avid way to be handling my media and doing the proxy workflow? Let me show you. So I'm going to use some files from a Sony camera from an older project I've done called The Treasurer. So these .mxfs, they are our clips. I've selected link, and for linking, Avid's, depending on the format, can require you to have the correct plugin. This is a very important thing that I go through in the AE100 series, go into ingesting media quite in depth. You can see here, Avid's recognized automatically which one to use, so we're all hunky-dory there. And I can hit link, and all these clips will appear in my bin that I've selected called importing. So go link. So with them linked, and we can see them in the background there, I'll come out of my source browser and take a look at these. So here you can see that all these clips load and they can be played. So we have all the clips in. So let's get into that proxy workflow. So if we right click these, we're not going to get any option called create optimized media or create proxies. What we do get is one called consolidate/transcode. So these are the two options that we get. So consolidate is going to rewrap the source clips into an MXF wrapper and put them in our Avid Media Files folder, which I showed you before, where Avid wants the media to be kept. Now, this is a perfectly acceptable way to go if your source media is already something like ProRes, which a lot of cameras like Aries do shoot in, so perfectly legitimate. But if it's not, and this is, an odd kind of AVC format, I think, then you're going to want to create Avid DNX MXFs, which are proxy format of choice, which is the transcode option. So here under transcodes, we have a variety of options, and I show this a bit in the A100 series, but for the sake of the proxy workflow, I'll do a quick recap. So on the left, we just select the drive that we want it to go to. We select the raster dimensions that we want our proxies to be at. My sources here are in 4K resolution, I think UHD actually. And I can maintain that source resolution in my proxies if I want by just hitting source dimensions. Or if I want to bring them down and have 1080p proxies, which is very, very common, then I'll just change this raster dimension option here to project dimensions. And then when it transcodes and makes your proxies, it's going to down-res them to the resolution of whatever your project's set to. In this case, it's actually 2K flat. Hey guys, Jack from the future here. There was a part of the recording that got a bit messed up, and so I'm just going to re-record and go over it now, just a tiny little bit. Now, as I have said in the video, I do go over this consolidate, transcode, and all the ingesting options much more depth in AE100, but there's two other points that I do think should be in this video before we move on to the rest of it. And that is, just to mention that up here you have the option to keep your source's frame rate or convert to your project's frame rate. Generally speaking, I would always keep the sources because we can always retime in Avid. If you convert to your source's frame rate, then you're kind of locked into that conversion, and it can mess up your timecode as well for relinking down the road. So I don't really like to convert to project frame rate. I think it is the default, and if I happen to know that my project frame rate and the source is the same, then I can leave it ticked and it's not really an issue. But the other one to mention is just below that. Avid calls it target video resolution, but it's not really resolution in the sense that we would think of it as, your raster dimensions. No, this is actually talking about your codec and your quality. So if we click in the drop-down menu here, we'll see the options we get. We basically get every flavor of DNX and ProRes. You might notice that ProRes and DNX 444 aren't there, but those are only enabled if you bump the color space of your project up to something like RGB or ACES, then they become available here. But DNX HRLB, low bitrate is what the LB stands for, would be absolutely perfectly fine for proxy workflows, just as Apple ProRes Proxy would be. Those are your two ideal for proxies. If you wanted to go the optimized media route that some of the other NLEs use, you could use DNX SQ or HQ or ProRes 422, for example. And then you'd have quite high quality media to make your exports on. And if you went all the way up to HQX or ProRes 422 HQ, you could arguably make your masters straight from those, depending on what you're doing and what you're delivering to. But yeah, I'll hand you back off to Past Jack now. I just wanted to add in those couple of points because they are important to know, and especially going forward into your proxy workflow. So back to the video. Linking, source scaling. We can convert the audio if you've got guide audio on the camera. And down the bottom we can choose whether to transcode this in the background or use the full CPU and just take up the application while you do it. Now there's a whole number of other options here that you can go through in terms of applying LUTs and conform options and reframing and frame flex and stuff. But for the purposes of powering through with this proxy workflow discussion, I'm not going to bother with that right now. Now, once we have all of our options selected, we could just come down here and hit transcode, and Avid will start transcoding away. But before we do that, there's one thing that is unique to Avid that we'll have to do here before we can create proxies or transcodes or whatever you want to call them. And that is, we have to apply what I like to call commonality. We have to apply some source information that is unique to each file, to the source and to the proxies, so that later on, when we have our locked edit full of proxies, proxy clips, because Avid will make separate clips, not link it to the same one, we can relink it back to the source master clips. Now there's a couple of ways to do this. If you're transcoding in Resolve, I've demonstrated this in my making Avid transcodes in Resolve video, where you can just tick to have the source file name duplicated into the tape column as you do the transcodes. Nice and easy, no problem. If you're doing it in Avid, however, at this stage, before I would make my transcodes, I would just come up here in my bin with all of my linked clips. And I'll just right click up here at the names of any one of these columns and go choose columns. And then we're just going to select a column that we can add in our commonality to. And we can do this with a few different columns. We can use cam roll, we could use disk label, or we could use lab roll. It doesn't really matter as long as this data is preserved between the source and the destination. So I'm going to use cam roll for the purposes of this demonstration. So OK. And since I right clicked and chose that at the name column, it's appeared just to the right of it, conveniently. And then I'll just select this column again, name. I'll do a Command D to duplicate. Avid will ask me which columns you want to duplicate the name info into, and I'll just select camera roll. Hit OK, then that's there. Now when I make transcodes of these clips, the transcodes will all have .new at the end of the name portion of the file name, but the source file name will be preserved under the camera roll. It will inherit any metadata that you add to it down the chain in Avid, and that will serve as our commonality for relinking. So here I've just transcoded a couple of these here, clips 41 and 43, and you can see here that Avid creates a new clip, .new, and adds the suffix of .new.01 onto the end of it. It does this whenever it creates new media and the source is still there. And you can see here as well that the icon for the clip is different. So this icon here represents a linked clip, so you're linking to the source. And this icon represents a clip that is within the Avid Media files. So that generally will be your proxy, but it could also be consolidated media. It just means that it's located within Avid Media files. Avid's tracking it and maintaining it, and the Avid's database files are keeping track of all the metadata of it. And so that's probably what we're going to be wanting to be working with. So all in all, the summary is that if you're in Avid Media Composer, the whole proxy workflow is essentially the same, just a lot more manual. It's being handled and tracked and relinked by the user, not by the software. Now, I'm not going to get into which system is better or worse. This is just the way it is in Avid and the way it has been for quite some time. But that's how you create your proxies. Why don't we take a look at what this will look at in practice in terms of a timeline of a locked edit with proxies, and then relinking it back to the source for mastering and transcoding and whatnot. So the clips we were looking at before, as mentioned, were from a short film called The Treasure. Here we can see the timeline of the lock cut for that short, and this is all our proxies. This is all our Avid Media files. And you'll be able to see if I link back to the source and find bin. Yeah, these are all proxies located inside our Avid Media files. You can tell by the icon, and it's DNXLB media, so it's DNX media. Now let's have a go at relinking this whole timeline back to the source original clips. So first off, I'll need to link in the source clips. So I've got a new bin here. I'm going to go back to my source browser, and I'm going to link in one by one all of the shoot days for The Treasure. A wee minute later. Now I have in my bin here all of the source camera clips for this entire short film, and I have my timeline that needs relinked to them. Now there's a couple of things I have to do before I can do this relink. First off is the problem that my transcoded clips and proxies that I'm using were created in DaVinci Resolve, not Avid Media Composer, and they've used the tape column for their metadata. Which would be fine if not for the fact that I can't batch edit the tape column in Avid Media Composer to apply the source file name into it. So we need a way to reconcile. So essentially we've lost our commonality. We don't have something that's the same between the proxies that are on my timeline, all these subclips here that are synced to new sound, and our source camera res. How do we fix that? Well, nice and easy. All we need is yet another bin. So I'm just going to create a temp bin. Right click anywhere in the bin and go set bin display. And I'll just tick this one down here, show reference clips. Now what this means is that if I duplicate a sequence and I drop a sequence in here, well any sequence really, and then I hit save, it's going to populate the bin with all the clips that are in that sequence. Now that I have this, I can go to scroll over here, see the tape column. I can see that this tape column is populated with all the source file names. And now I'll just do what I did before when I was showing the linking in Avid workflow, and I'll duplicate this tape column info into camroll, and then we can use camroll from then onward. So choose columns, select camroll, and then duplicate tape into camroll. So great, so now we have our commonality in camroll, and then under my LinkedIn clips that I have here, I can go to camroll, do the same there, Now we have commonality. We have the same information in the proxies and in the sources. So when Avid goes to relink my timeline here to these sources, it's going to look for two things for each clip in order to link it to a different source. It's going to look for the timecode, and it's going to look for whatever commonality I set. I'm going to point it towards camera roll, but you could point it towards tape or name or whatever. As long as our commonality is preserved and you have your timecode, which shouldn't change, then you should be able to relink without too much issue. All that's required is to select your sources in the bin. So I'll just do a Command A here, that's all my sources. Then I'll come round to my timeline, which is visible down below. And I'll do right click, relink. Now the latest version of Avid gives us two options here. There's there's relink managed media, and there's linked media. So if I do managed media, it's going to open the traditional Avid relink window, which has always been there, and that's what we're going to be dealing with. Linked media is to do with relinking linked files. So if you're just working with linked files and then they've gone offline, you can use this linked media bin to directly point to where on the drive those files are that have went missing or went offline to relink them. Yeah. But we're going to go relink managed media. So I know a lot of editors that have came from other platforms, and this window here has kind of freaked them out. They really don't like it. They've tried all kinds of relink things and they can't get stuff to relink when it goes offline, or they're trying to link back to the source. I haven't had too much of an issue with it, but that's because I've been kind of very trained in the way of Avid logic, in terms of the work that I've done, the experiences I've had. So let me give you a quick rundown of it, because I think it'd be good for people to know, and then we'll relink our timeline to the sources. So first off, you're going to set where you're going to relink to, like where are your sources, where's the media you're trying to relink to. You do that up the top. There's a drop down menu, you can select all the available drives that are there, all the volumes. So I'm going to select my RAID. And this is just so that when you're doing a scan, it doesn't have to look at literally everything. The more you can narrow where the media is, the faster it's going to do it. This relink only to media from the current project, I've never found to be particularly helpful though. Because what this is doing is, it's the project metadata column that's attached to the files. The actual metadata, it can be tagged to a specific project. So if you make transcodes in the Avid project, it'll be tagged to that. If you make transcodes in a Resolve project, then it's going to be tagged to the name of that Resolve project. So especially if you're relinking the transcodes that were done outside of Avid, you're going to want that unticked. I generally just never have it ticked. And load media databases, Avid, inside its Avid media file folders, it's stacked with lots and lots and lots of folders. And in each one of those, there's a little database folder, a little MDB. And if you have this ticked, it's going to load all the information that's in all of those and do a scan of. So basically, it'll scan all of the media. It's like what's available before it starts relinking. If you haven't done this in a while, that's kind of good to do. So I'll always leave that one ticked. And then all of these are just, then all the options below are kind of just getting more specific about what you're pointing it to. Here by default, it's looking to relink based on start time code and tape name or source file ID, which wouldn't work for us because we're not using tape, we're using camera. It's going to want to match the case, which I normally untick because don't see why. And do you want to relink to media that is only the exact resolution of your current project? I always get rid of that as well. Just any video format. Basically, I'm changing options here that are really limiting the search. I just want it to be able to search based on the specific criteria that I'm mentioning, which it will be start time code and camera roll. I don't want it to be looking for media of a specific resolution, especially since I'm using mixed resolutions. And you can choose which tracks to relink. So maybe you just want to relink the audio of a file, maybe you want to relink just the video of a file, or the data. You can pick whichever mixture of the three that it is that you want to relink. Because remember, you're not just always relinking to go back to online or because it's gone offline, but because you want to change what the source is on a clip. Maybe you got better transcodes done with a better LUT, for example. Right, but that's enough of that. Let's relink our timeline. So a couple of options we just need to tweak before we can do that. First is actually way up the top here. So instead of relinking to media on a drive where it has to scan the whole drive and look for media that meets the criteria, I'm going to select selected items in all open bin. And then if you select that, it's going to try and relink to the specific media that you've got selected in your bin. And we've already selected our sources, so we're really narrowing the media it has to search. It's like, just look at these and relink to the ones that match what's on the timeline. Then down here, and relink by, we'll set our criteria. So start, timecode, that's fine. And source, I'll change to camera. So it's going to look at the specific clips I've selected, and it's going to look for stuff that matches the timeline based on start timecode and cam roll, which we've set, and is the same between the proxy and the source. So that should be everything that you need to do to relink this timeline. And I sure hope it works, because I'm going to look like a right idiot if it doesn't. So here we go. Okay. And it's relinked, and I had create new sequence selected, so it's created a new sequence called .relinked01. Avid likes this .01 naming conventions. And you can see if I click and change to this sequence, this version of it, the timeline here will change. It'll look slightly less colourful, I imagine. There we go. So now I'm looking fully at the source clips. You can see they're all kind of milky in colour here. That's because it was shot in log. So this is the source clips that came straight from the camera. And if I zoom in, it's no longer my synced subclips names that are named by the slate. It is the source camera names. And this is how you would do it if you were relinking back, if you were going to do the online in Avid, in Symfony or something like that. And once you had your timeline there and you had your source clips and everything was relinked, that would more or less conclude, bring full circle the proxy workflow. You've started with your source clips, transcoded them, worked through your edit with those, and now you've relinked back to the source. Now, before I end the video there, I'll just show you as a little bonus how you would relink this timeline in another application. For example, DaVinci Resolve. If you were going to do your online elsewhere, like you would cut using proxies in Avid, but you wanted to relink the timeline elsewhere in something like DaVinci Resolve to your camera originals to finish off. So what we need to provide here would be an AAF. So I'm going to export one out just like I did in the last module of A100. So included all the video tracks, we're just linking to them, no media. So here we are in Resolve, and I've exported an AAF out of Avid, a linked AAF. You can see in the online deliverables part of the A100 series the settings that I used, but I'll have them on the screen just now anyway if you really wanted to take a screen grab of that. And I'll go File, Import, Timeline, and then I'll just navigate to my AAF. Yep. Open that. Now we get a whole bunch of options here when we go to import the AAF. And Resolve is really, really good here. It's automatically going to set the project settings in terms of the frame rate and stuff like that based on what's in the AAF. It's going to try and automatically import the source clips into the media pool as well. But we actually don't want it to do this. This is it's trying to do a bit too much, a bit over enthusiastic. Because if it did that, it would try and bring in the clips that the AAF is pointing to, and the AAF is going to be pointing to the proxy Avid Media that's in the Avid Media files, and we don't want that. We want to link to source camera files. So if we tick this little checkbox here, it's going to try and find the source camera files as it brings in the AAF. So I'll have that ticked, and I'll hit OK. Choose where I'm putting it in the timeline. There we go. And then we just get a log of clips that aren't supported, and these are all effects actually, so effects that are on Avid timeline. And this is why I would normally send, online a list of all the effects I've done and details of exactly what effects we used and how, and then we'd get a reference file as well. But in terms of relinking, it's been successful. We can see here, if I zoom in and out the timeline, that all of the picture here has survived. It's all come through. And even the markers that I had on my timeline with the details of the effects have come through as well. You can see here, online respeed this to 200%, for example. So there we go. We have our timeline, our offline blocked to edit timeline with Avid proxies from Avid, relinked in Resolve. No problem at all. Now, of course, this is just a video, but if you're in online and you're going to relink back to the source clips anyway, you're probably going to be bringing in a sound mix or something else. But if you really did want to bring in your sound from Avid, you could do that too, which is also demonstrated in the online handovers in AE100. It's actually the final video, the part 2, where I go into delivering to sound. You can go check that out there. But as for everything else, I really hope this has covered the proxy workflow in Avid enough for everybody. This is something that seems to get asked on Facebook a lot about linking and importing and linking back to the source later on for exports and things like that. It seems to be something that's asked quite a lot, so that's hence why I thought I'd do the video. So I really, really do hope it's answered all your questions. If it has, give the video a like, share it with your friends. And if it's not, comment down below with what I've missed out, and I can cover it in another video elsewhere. But until then, guys, thank you very much for watching, and especially thanks to my Patreon subscribers who are getting access to some extra content over there, especially some insight into my workflows and how I approach things. Really just thank you everybody for watching. I always do really appreciate it. These videos were for fun initially, so I do appreciate people watching them. But until the next one, thank you all. See you then.